The dust had not yet settled from the stagecoach's violent departure when Clara Whitfield realized she had been left entirely alone in a town whose name she could not even pronounce correctly. Redemption, Texas, 1878. A place where the sun hung so low and heavy in the afternoon sky that it pressed against the earth like a man trying to crush something beneath his boot. Where the streets were wide enough to turn a cattle drive around, and the saloons outnumbered the churches by a count that would have made her late mother clutch her Bible to her chest and pray double time. Clara stood in the middle of the main road, her traveling trunk balanced precariously at her feet, one of its brass clasps broken clean off from where the stagecoach driver had flung it down without ceremony or apology. She had $3.42 in the small velvet pouch tucked into her corset, a letter of introduction from her late father's business associate in St. Louis, and absolutely no idea what to do next. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a failed banker who had drunk himself into an early grave that past February, and she had taken the last of her inheritance and bought a one-way ticket to redemption because the advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch had described it as a town of growing opportunity for those willing to work hard and start fresh. The advertisement had not mentioned the fact that the town's only hotel appeared to be double-booked, nor that the letter of introduction she carried was addressed to a man named Gerald Holt, who, she would soon learn, had died of a rattlesnake bite 3 weeks prior. She picked up her trunk by its leather handle, dragged it to the shade of the general store's covered porch, and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of despair before straightening her spine and lifting her chin. That was how her mother had always handled disaster, and the method had served well enough, even if her mother had eventually succumbed to typhoid rather than to any crisis she could have straightened herself out of. The general store behind her was called Prentice & Sons, and its front window displayed a sun-bleached arrangement of patent medicines, seed packets, and a single lady's hat that had gone so far out of fashion it was almost charming. She turned to push inside, thinking she would at least ask someone where she might find lodging, when the door swung outward and collided directly with her face. The edge caught her just above her right eye, not hard enough to split the skin, but hard enough to knock her backward 2 full steps and cause her vision to erupt in brief, brilliant stars. Good God! A man's voice, low and immediate. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She pressed her fingers to her forehead and blinked the stars away, and when her vision cleared, she found herself looking up at the sort of man that women in St. Louis drew in secret in the margins of their diaries and then pretended they had not. He was perhaps 28. Tall in the manner of someone who had grown accustomed to ducking through low doorways, with dark hair curling slightly at his collar beneath a worn brown hat. His jaw was set with a day's worth of dark stubble, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray that the sky above the Missouri River turned just before a storm rolled in. He wore a plain cotton shirt, dark trousers, boots that had seen serious use, and a belt with a holster from which no gun was currently drawn, though the holster itself bore the quiet confidence of something well-maintained and regularly relied upon. He was staring at her with an expression of genuine concern, his large hands hovering near her arms as though he had almost caught her when she stumbled, and had not quite managed to decide whether he should try again. "I am fine," she said, with considerably more dignity than her situation warranted. "You are swaying," he said. "I am not swaying, I am simply standing in an uneven road." He glanced down at the road, which was, in fact, quite flat at that particular spot, and then back at her, and the corner of his mouth moved almost imperceptibly, as though it was considering a smile and had decided this was not yet the appropriate moment. "Here," he said, and before she could protest, he had taken hold of her arm, steady and firm without being rough, and guided her to sit on the edge of the porch beside her trunk. He crouched in front of her and looked at the place above her eye with focused attention. "It is not going to bruise badly, might swell a little. "Thank you for the medical assessment," she said. He looked at her then with those gray eyes, and something in his expression shifted in a way she could not quite categorize. "You are not from here," he said. "What a remarkable observation." He sat back on his heels, studying her with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "You just arrived on the stage." "I did." "Where are you headed?" "Here, as it happens." She paused. "I have a letter of introduction for a Gerald Holt, who, I have been informed, is no longer available to receive it." The man's expression changed again, more subtly this time, something that might have been sympathy moving through his gray eyes. "You knew Gerald?" "I knew of him. My father did business with him some years ago." She pressed her fingers to the side of her head, where the ache was settling into something manageable. "I don't suppose you know where a person newly arrived in redemption might find decent and affordable lodging." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that suggested he was actually thinking about the answer rather than preparing a polite dismissal. "The hotel is full up most of the week because of the cattlemen's exchange. Mrs. Draper takes in boarders on Elm Street, second house from the corner. She is particular about her rules, but she keeps a clean house and the food is good." Clara studied him. He had the look of a man who knew this town well, who moved through it with an ease that came from belonging to it, not just passing through it. He also had the look of a man who was not particularly accustomed to standing still and conversing with strange women outside of general stores, and the fact that he was still crouching there, still watching her with that steady gray gaze, felt like something worth noting. "You are very helpful for someone who nearly knocked me insensible with a door," she said. "I'll grant you that," he said quietly. She extended her hand. It was perhaps forward of her, but she had never been particularly good at performing helplessness when she did not feel it, and something about him made formality feel unnecessary. "Clara Whitfield," she said. He took her hand and shook it once, his grip measured and warm. "Glad to meet you, Miss Whitfield." And then, because she realized she had simply assumed he would introduce himself in return and he had not, she said, with slightly raised eyebrows, "I don't know your name." He looked at her for a moment that lasted just a beat longer than was strictly necessary for a simple reply, and something in those storm-gray eyes took on a quality she could not name, something warm and deliberate and quietly certain. "It's Cole," he said, "Cole Merritt, and I have a feeling that matters a great deal more to me than it does to you right now." Clara Whitfield, who had received proposals from 3 different men in St. Louis, who had been courted by a banker's son and a cotton merchant and a young lawyer who wrote her terrible poetry, who had never once felt her pulse rise at the sound of a name, sat on the edge of a porch in Redemption, Texas, with a lump forming above her eye and $3 in her corset, and found that she had, quite without intending to, forgotten every single one of those men's names entirely. She recovered herself quickly enough to say something sensible about the direction of Elm Street, and he stood and carried her trunk for her the 3 blocks to Mrs. Draper's house without being asked, set it on the porch, tipped his hat and walked away. She watched him go. She told herself she did not watch him go. Both things were equally true. Mrs. Abigail Draper was a widow of 53 who wore her gray hair in a precise bun and ran her boarding house with the kind of firm benevolence usually associated with well-organized convents. She had 4 rules. No spirits in the rooms, no male visitors above the parlor floor, meals at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, and no crying where the other boarders could hear it because it made everyone uncomfortable. She showed Clara to a room on the 2nd floor that was small and clean, and had a window that looked out over the backyard's kitchen garden, where 3 chickens regarded the world with the weary dignity of creatures who had long since made peace with their situation. Clara unpacked her trunk, hung her 2 good dresses in the narrow wardrobe, set her mother's small framed miniature portrait on the windowsill, and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap. She needed to find work. The $3.42 would cover perhaps 2 weeks of Mrs. Draper's rates if she was careful. She needed something steady, and she needed it soon, and she needed to do it all in a town where she knew absolutely no one, save for a man named Cole Merritt who had carried her trunk and told her his name meant a great deal more to him than it did to her. She thought about that. She thought about it more than was probably wise. In the morning, she dressed carefully in her better dress, the blue one with the fitted waist that her mother had always said made her look capable and serious, and she went to every business on the main street and inquired about work. The land office wanted a man with surveying experience. The telegraph office had no openings. The two saloons each offered employment of a kind that she declined politely and firmly. The doctor's office was run by a Dr. Theodore Kane, a harried, bespectacled man of about 60 who listened to her speak for 30 seconds, and then said he needed someone to manage his patient records and correspondence, and that he had been managing it himself for 2 years and was doing it very badly, and could she start tomorrow? She could start tomorrow. She started that afternoon. Dr. Kane's patient records were a disaster of legendary proportions. She spent the first 3 days simply sorting and cataloging what he had, creating a system of organization based on patient name and date of treatment, and constructing a schedule for his visits that did not, as his previous non-system had done, book 2 patients for the same time on alternating Thursdays. He paid her $8 a month, which was not lavish but was enough, and he let her go at 5 o'clock each day, which allowed her to reach Mrs. Draper's table before the other boarders claimed the better cuts of whatever was being served. She saw Cole Merritt 3 days after their introduction. She was crossing the main street with a package of filing folders she had purchased at Prentice & Sons, and he was coming out of the sheriff's office with another man, a heavy-set fellow with a deputy's badge who was laughing at something Cole had just said. Cole saw her at the same moment she saw him, and he touched the brim of his hat, and she gave a small nod, and they continued in their respective directions. It was, by any objective measure, a completely unremarkable exchange. She thought about it for approximately 4 hours afterward. She learned things about him the way you learn things about anyone in a small town, through the slow accumulation of other people's idle remarks, without ever quite intending to seek the information out. He was a rancher, owned a spread called the Double M about 6 miles south of town, ran cattle, and a small operation of horse breeding. He had come to Redemption 8 years ago from somewhere in Wyoming, though the details of why he had left were not a subject he apparently volunteered, and not a subject anyone seemed entirely certain about. He was well regarded, the sort of man who showed up when someone needed help building a barn or pulling a wagon out of a ditch. He was not married, and he had not, according to Mrs. Draper, who shared information about her town with the generous enthusiasm of someone who kept a comprehensive mental ledger, been seriously courting anyone since a woman named Adelaide Forsyth had come to town 2 years prior, stayed for 6 months, and then decided that redemption was not what she had been hoping for and taken the stage back east. He was not broken up about it, from what I could tell, Mrs. Draper told Clara one evening as they shelled peas on the back porch together, which was one of Mrs. Draper's preferred ways of conducting conversations she found interesting. Not the sort of man who shows much outwardly. But I think he was lonely before Adelaide came, and lonelier after, which is a different kind of lonely altogether. Clara was quiet for a moment, running her thumb along a pod. He seemed self-sufficient. Self-sufficient is often a word that polite people use when what they mean is that a man has forgotten someone is supposed to be waiting at home, Mrs. Draper said, and dropped a handful of peas into the bowl with a decisive sound. The first time they actually spoke at length was 10 days after she arrived, and it happened because of a horse. She was walking back from the doctor's office in the early evening, taking the slightly longer route because the light at that hour was extraordinary, the kind of golden late summer light that turned even the dullest landscape into something that deserved to be painted. She heard the sound before she saw the cause, a high, strained sound from somewhere down the side alley between the livery stable and the harness shop, and she turned without thinking. There was a young horse, a dark bay filly, pressed against the fence of a small paddock, one of her rear legs caught in the lower rail where she had apparently kicked through a rotted board and then twisted herself into a worse position trying to get free. She was trembling, her eyes white-rimmed with panic, sweat already dark on her neck, and every time she moved, the board's jagged edge bit deeper into the soft tissue above her hock. Clara had grown up with horses. Her father, before the bank had failed and the drinking had gotten serious, had kept 3, and she had ridden before she could properly write her own name. She did not think. She set her package down, went through the gate, and moved toward the filly with slow, deliberate steps, talking in a low, continuous murmur, not words so much as sound, something rhythmic, and even that said to the animal that the world was not ending, that someone had arrived who was not afraid. The filly shivered but stopped fighting. Clara got close enough to lay one hand flat on the animal's sweat-soaked shoulder and keep it there while she assessed the leg with her other hand. The board needed to be broken away from below, or the filly needed to be guided backward at an angle that would clear the rail. She was trying to determine which was the more practical option when she heard boots on the ground behind her and looked up. Cole Merritt was standing at the paddock fence, hat in hand, looking at the scene with the quick assessing gaze of someone who understood horses and was already calculating the problem. "She kicked through the bottom rail," Clara said, keeping her voice even so as not to startle the filly. "If I can get her to step back on a diagonal, she might clear it, but I need someone to break that board away from the post at the same time so the movement does not drive the edge further in." Cole had already come through the gate and was moving along the fence. He found the point where the board met the post, gave it a careful assessment with his hands, and looked at her. "On your say." She moved her hand from the filly's shoulder to her halter, keeping the contact continuous, letting the animal's breathing match itself to the steadiness of her own. She kept talking, low and even, and she turned the filly's head just slightly to the left to encourage the shift of weight that would angle the step backward and to the right. "Now," she said quietly. Cole applied his weight and strength to the board in a single controlled movement, and the filly stepped back, and the leg came free with a sound that made Clara wince, and then the animal was standing clear, trembling but free, nosing at Clara's shoulder with the desperate gratitude of something that has been relieved of pain. Clara ran her hands down the leg immediately, checking the wound. It was ugly but not catastrophic. The skin was broken and there was blood, and it would need cleaning and care, but nothing structural had been compromised. She straightened and found Cole standing close, watching her hands on the horse with an expression she could not read, but that was not casual. "She belongs to Joe Hennessy," he said. "He is at the saloon most evenings." "Someone needs to clean this wound and bandage it properly tonight," Clara said. "It cannot wait until Mr. Hennessy remembers he owns a horse." Cole looked at the filly, then at Clara. "I have what's needed back at my saddle. It is in the livery." He paused. "If you would not mind staying with her." "I am not going anywhere," Clara said. He was back in 4 minutes with a small kit, the kind that practical horsemen kept, because emergencies with animals did not schedule themselves. They worked together without much discussion, which Clara found remarkable, because in her experience, people who had not worked together before usually narrated their own actions with excessive commentary as a way of filling the silence and demonstrating competence. Cole did neither. He simply moved with a quiet assurance that matched itself to her own, and they cleaned and dressed the wound with a shared efficiency that felt oddly intimate, as though they had done it 100 times before. When they were finished and the filly was standing easier, her breathing settled, the wound wrapped cleanly, Cole leaned against the fence and looked at Clara in the golden evening light with those gray eyes that she was trying very hard not to think of as the most interesting eyes she had ever seen. "Where did you learn horses?" he asked. "My father kept them when I was young," she said, "before things changed." He waited, not pressing, which she appreciated. "He was a banker in St. Louis," she said. "He did well for a time. Then he did not. Then he died, and the only asset remaining was the ability to make one's own way, which is why I am here." She said it simply because it was simple. She had not told anyone else in Redemption the unvarnished version of that story. She was not entirely sure why she was telling him now, except that he had not asked out of nosiness but out of genuine interest, and there was something in the quality of his attention that made dishonesty feel effortful. "Your way seems to be going well," he said after a pause. "I work for Dr. Kane. I know. He told me his records had been organized by someone and that it was a miracle akin to the parting of the Red Sea." She laughed. It was not a restrained or polite laugh. It was a real one, sudden and unguarded, and it surprised both of them. His face changed when she laughed, something in it opening and warming like a room when someone finally lights the fire in the hearth. They walked back toward the main street together when the light had fully gone, and he stopped at the corner of Elm Street where they would have to part ways, and he said, "Miss Whitfield, would you allow me to show you something this Sunday? The land south of town is worth seeing when the autumn light is on it." It was a perfectly proper invitation. There was nothing in it she could reasonably object to. And she looked at him for a moment with the full awareness that this was a choice she was making, not a thing that was simply happening to her, and she said, "I think I would like that very much, Mr. Merritt." He touched his hat and walked away, and she stood on the corner of Elm Street in the warm Texas evening and acknowledged to herself, with the clear-eyed pragmatism that had always been her best feature, that she was in a considerable amount of trouble. Sunday came with a sky so blue and wide it seemed excessive, the kind of sky that made you feel small in the best possible way, as though the world was enormous and you were fortunate enough to be standing inside it. Cole arrived at Mrs. Draper's house at 10 in the morning with 2 horses, a solid-looking roan for himself and a steady-tempered gray mare for her, and Mrs. Draper watched from the front window with an expression that was carefully neutral in the manner of someone who has strong feelings they are exercising admirable restraint about not voicing. Clara wore her second-best dress, the brown one with the practical skirt that allowed proper movement, and she mounted the gray without assistance in the way that she had always mounted horses, with clean efficiency, and Cole watched this with an expression that she was now beginning to recognize as his version of being impressed, which was not a raised eyebrow or a compliment but simply a slight change in the quality of his attention. They rode south out of town, along a track that wound through land that flattened and then rose, and then gave way to something that made Clara stop her horse entirely and simply look. Rolling grassland spread in every direction, tawny gold in the autumn sun, broken by the dark lines of live oak and cedar along the creek bottoms, and in the distance, the land lifted into low hills that in the morning light were purple and blue and something that had no particular name but was very beautiful. "This is yours?" she asked. "6 miles that way," he said, pointing south. "Where the creek bends." She looked at the land for a long moment. In St. Louis, land was something that existed between buildings, the narrow allotments that defined streets and property lines. This was something else, something that did not need to be defined because it simply was. "It must have taken courage to come here," she said, "to build something from nothing." He was quiet beside her. "It took more stubbornness than courage," he said. "I'm not sure they are always different things." She turned to look at him. He was watching the land with an expression she understood now as his version of love, the same quiet, certain quality he brought to everything he cared about, no performance in it, no announcement. "Why did you come to Texas?" she asked. "From Wyoming." He did not answer immediately. She had learned that his silences were not avoidance but consideration, that he did not say things he had not thought about. "My family had land in Wyoming," he said finally. "My father and my older brother. We did not agree on much by the time I was 20, particularly on how to treat the people who worked for us." He paused. "My father believed that men who worked for wages had no claim on dignity. I did not agree. I left before I became someone I did not want to be." Clara looked at him. The afternoon light was on his face, and he was looking at the horizon with the absolute stillness of someone who has made peace with a hard thing and carries it steadily. "And here," she asked softly, "here I built it the way I thought it should be," he said. "Every man on the Double M is paid a fair wage and treated with respect. That includes every man without regard to where they came from or what they look like." He glanced at her. "That is not the most popular position in Texas in 1878. I am aware of it." She held his gaze. "It is the correct one." Something in his face shifted, subtle and warm, as though she had given him something he had not known he was waiting for. They rode further, following the creek for a while, and he showed her where he had first built a one-room dugout the winter he arrived, before the house. The dugout was still there, its low door almost buried in the hillside, half swallowed by time and grass. He told her about that first winter with a dry humor that made her laugh again, stories about collapsed walls and a stove that had produced more smoke than heat, and a horse that had eaten its way through the door twice before he built it a proper stall. He was not performing the stories for effect. He was simply telling her things, honestly and without embellishment, and she found herself leaning slightly forward in the saddle as he talked, the way you leaned into warmth. They stopped by the creek and let the horses drink, and sat on a flat limestone rock in the shade of a cottonwood, while the water moved past them with the easy purpose of water that has somewhere to be. She told him about St. Louis, really told him, not the polished version she gave to people she was not sure about, but the full version, her father's slow unraveling, the mortification of watching everything sold off piece by piece, the way their friends had contracted into a smaller and smaller circle as the money disappeared until there was almost no circle left, and finally the reading of the will in the attorney's office, where the sum total of her father's estate was a silver watch, her mother's portrait miniature, and enough money for a one-way stagecoach ticket to a new start. He listened to all of it without pity, which was what she had always hated about telling the story to anyone, the careful constructed sympathy that was really just relief that it had happened to someone else. He listened with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, level and real and completely present. "You are braver than you know," he said when she had finished. "Or more foolish," she said. "No," he said quietly. "Brave." They rode back toward town in the late afternoon, the golden light long and sideways across the grass, their shadows stretching out ahead of them like advanced scouts. At the edge of town, where the track met the road, they slowed the horses to a walk, and she was very aware of the space between them, the exact distance between his horse and hers, which felt more significant than it had any logical right to be. "I would like to do this again," he said, "if you would be willing." "I think I would be very willing," she said. He took her horse's reins when they reached Mrs. Draper's and she dismounted, and he held them while she straightened her skirt, and she looked up at him in the late light and found him already looking at her with that steady gray gaze that she was no longer pretending not to feel. "Next Sunday, then," she said. "Next Sunday," he agreed. It became Sunday after Sunday, and then not just Sundays. He found reasons to come into town on the days he knew she was at the doctor's office. Not contrived reasons, but genuine ones, business at the land office, supplies from the general store, and he would happen to be walking past at 5 o'clock when she came out, and they would walk together the long way around to Mrs. Draper's because neither of them was in a hurry for it to end. They talked about everything. She discovered he had read widely, more than she expected, and had opinions about things that surprised her with their precision and thoughtfulness. He had strong views about the nature of fairness, about the responsibility of those with resources toward those without, about the land and what people owed it in return for what it gave them. She pushed back when she disagreed, which was not infrequently, and he did not find this alarming or disarranging. He seemed, in fact, to find it interesting. Redemption was small enough that people noticed. Mrs. Draper did not say anything directly, which, given her usual verbal generosity, was itself a form of commentary. "Doctor," Kane said, with studied casualness one morning while she was filing, I understand you have been spending time with Cole Merritt." And when she confirmed this without elaboration, he said, "He is a good man. One of the few in this county I would say that about without qualification," and returned to his examination of a patient's chart with the air of a man who had said exactly what he intended to say. The thing happened in November, when the weather had turned, and the sky over Texas had gone from limitless blue to a lower, grayer ceiling that brought with it a cold edge off the plains. She was coming out of Prentice and Sons on a Tuesday afternoon when she heard raised voices from the direction of the land office, and then, sharply, her own name. She turned. Two men she did not know were talking to Walter Sims, who owned the land office, and one of them, a florid man in an expensive coat that was not quite right for the climate, was holding a document and speaking with the aggressive confidence of someone who believes money gives him the right to any volume he chooses. She did not recognize either of them, but she recognized the posture and the manner, the same kind of aggressive certainty she had seen on the men who had come to the bank when her father's situation had become untenable. Men who had decided that something that belonged to someone else actually belonged to them, and the only question was the speed of the transaction. She was not part of this situation. It was not her concern. She kept walking. She mentioned it to Cole that evening when they met for dinner at the restaurant that Mrs. Harkness ran on the east side of the main street, a small place with red-checkered tablecloths and very good beef stew. She described the scene without any particular significance, simply as a thing she had observed, and she watched Cole's face go through a careful change that she had learned to read by now as the suppression of something significant. "What did the man in the expensive coat look like?" he asked. She described him. Cole set down his fork with a deliberateness that was the opposite of casual. "His name is Garland Bryce," he said. "He has been buying up land south of town for the past year. Not fairly." He paused. "Two of my neighbors have already been pressured into selling." "Pressured how?" "Their water rights were contested." Legal challenges that are expensive to fight and that a small operation cannot sustain for long. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "He has been making inquiries about the double M. I have had 2 offers in the past month, both below any reasonable value." She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" He met her eyes steadily. "Whatever I need to," he said. "I did not build that ranch to give it away to a man who uses lawyers the way some men use fists." She was quiet. "You need your own lawyer, I know. There is one in Amarillo," she said. "I came through it on the stage. There was a sign for a firm. I cannot remember the name now, but I could write to the telegraph office and inquire." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression was very warm. "You have been here 6 weeks," he said, "and you already know this town better than men who have been here 20 years. "I pay attention," she said simply. They wrote the telegraph together the next morning at the office, and she helped him draft the inquiry with the focused clarity she brought to Dr. Kane's correspondence, precise and specific and impossible to misunderstand. The response came back within 3 days, and a lawyer named Marcus Webb arrived from Amarillo on the Friday stage. A neat, sharp-minded man of 40 who wore his profession in every line of his face, and who, upon reviewing Cole's documentation and the nature of Bryce's maneuvers, said with professional satisfaction that Bryce had made several errors in the filing of his water rights challenges that would take exactly the kind of careful legal argument that he was particularly good at. Clara was not party to most of these conversations, but she was present when they mattered because Cole wanted her there, had asked her directly, and she had understood that the asking itself was something important about who he was, that he did not regard her presence as a decorative addition, but as the thing it actually was, which was useful and real. The legal matter took 6 weeks to wind through the county court, and there were days when the outcome was not certain, and Cole rode into town on those days with a tightness around his jaw that she had learned to read. She did not offer reassurance that she could not guarantee. She offered instead the actual thing she could give, which was her attention, her company, her willingness to sit with him in the difficulty without pretending it was not difficult. He won. Marcus Webb argued the water rights challenges into oblivion on the grounds that Bryce's filings had improperly described the creek boundaries. And the judge, a weathered man who appeared to harbor a natural and well-founded suspicion of florid men in expensive coats, ruled in Cole's favor with a finality that left no room for appeal. Garland Bryce left redemption the following week, and the two neighbors who had been pressured into selling did not get their land back, which was a sobering reminder of the injustice that could happen to those who had less in the way of resources and connections. And Cole said as much to Clara on the ride home from the courthouse, his voice quiet and his face turned toward the winter sky. Jim Aldrete should not have lost that land, he said. Jim Aldrete was a Mexican-American farmer who had been one of the first pushed out by Bryce's methods. He had worked that place for 12 years. His family is there. Is there anything that can be done? She asked. Cole was quiet for a ride of some distance. Maybe, he said. Webb said there might be grounds for a separate challenge if the original purchase could be shown to have been made under duress. It would take time. Then it will take time, she said. He looked at her across the narrow distance between their horses, and his gray eyes were very full of something that had been building for weeks and that she could feel the weight of the way you could feel a coming storm, not unpleasant but enormous. Clara, he said. Cole, she said, I think you know what I want to say. I think I do, she said. Will you let me say it anyway? The corner of his mouth had moved again, that almost smile that she had catalogued by now, and found entirely unfair in its effect on her. Please, she said. He slowed his horse and she slowed hers, and they stopped in the middle of the track in the gray December afternoon, with the wind moving through the grass around them and the sky low and wide, and entirely indifferent to the significance of the moment. I have thought about almost nothing but you for 2 months, he said, with the same direct simplicity he brought to everything he said, no preamble, no performance. I have thought about you in the morning when the light comes in, and in the evening when it goes, and at every point between. I have thought about the way you handle a frightened horse, and the way you write a telegraph message, and the way you laugh when something strikes you as genuinely funny instead of politely funny. And I have thought about what it would be like to have the right to call this. He gestured between them with a slight motion, something real and permanent. And I am asking you if you would give me that right. She looked at him for a long moment, the wind moving her hair against her cheek, the gray afternoon light making everything clear and honest. You are asking me to court you formally, she said. I am asking you to consider that I love you, he said. The formal courtship is the first part of wherever that goes. Clara Whitfield, who had $3.42 when she arrived, and who had rebuilt her entire life from nothing in the space of 2 months, who had not known that she was looking for anything except a fresh start, looked at Cole Merritt in the December light and felt something settle inside her with the quiet rightness of a thing that has found its correct place. I would like very much to consider that, she said. He reached across the space between them and took her gloved hand in his, and held it, and neither of them said anything else for a while because nothing else was necessary. They were formally courting by Christmas, which meant, in the way of things in Redemption, Texas in 1878, that they were the subject of warm and extensive community awareness. Mrs. Draper made no attempt to conceal her satisfaction. Dr. Kane expressed his approval in the form of giving Clara 2 days off at the end of December, which was his version of a heartfelt emotional display. The other boarders at Mrs. Draper's, 3 men who worked at the land office and a schoolteacher named Miss Patterson, received the news with varying degrees of enthusiasm and resignation. Cole began bringing her to the Double M on Sundays. The ranch was modest in the way of things built by one man over 8 years, nothing extravagant, but solid and well-made, and full of the particular quality of places that have been cared for. The house had 4 rooms, a main room that served as kitchen and sitting room, a room Cole used as an office, a storeroom and the bedroom, which she did not see except from the doorway when he showed her around, and which he spoke of briefly and without self-consciousness as the room he intended to add to before long. The hands who worked the double M were three men: a broad-shouldered former freedman named Ezra who had come north from Louisiana after the war, and who managed the horses with a gift that bordered on telepathy; a quiet young man of Mexican descent named Raphael who was 19 and had a way with cattle that seemed almost conversational; and an older white man named Hatch who did the fence lines and the heavy work, and who was the sort of man who communicated primarily through grunts and physical demonstrations of competence. They accepted Clara with the specific kind of approval that people who know someone well express when the person they know well appears to have made a good decision. Ezra said, the second time she visited, "Mr. Cole has been better these last months, better than before. I thought you ought to know." He said it simply and then went back to what he had been doing, which was braiding a new lead rope, and Clara carried the words with her carefully. Christmas in Redemption was a quieter affair than the Christmases of her childhood in St. Louis, which had involved her mother's elaborate decorating and her father's professional associates gathered for eggnog and studied cheerfulness. The town's church put up a tree, and there was a social on Christmas Eve that ran from 7 until midnight in the church hall, with fiddle music and dancing and remarkable quantities of pie. Cole danced with her, which was something she had not anticipated, because he had the general manner of a man whose body was accustomed to practical work rather than social performance, and she had assumed he would hold her at arm's length and move through the steps with the careful stiffness of the reluctant. He did not. He danced well, not showily, but with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything, his hand warm and certain at her waist, his other hand steady around her fingers, and when the fiddle shifted into something slower, and the room around them blurred into a warm haze of lamplight and laughter. She looked up at him, and he was already looking at her with those gray eyes that she had stopped trying to find adequate descriptions for, and had simply accepted as one of the permanent features of her interior landscape. "You are remarkable," she told him quietly, in the middle of the dance floor with Redemption celebrating around them. "You are everything," he said. In the same quiet way he said all the important things, as though they were simply facts he was reporting. She was so thoroughly in love with him by January that it had stopped being a discovery, and had become simply the condition of things, as natural and constant as the Texas wind. She was in love with his steadiness and his honesty and the way he thought about things carefully before he spoke. She was in love with the fact that he had strong opinions about justice, and the courage to act on them even when it cost him socially. She was in love with the way he handled the horses on the double M, the particular gentleness that large and physically capable people sometimes have for things that are smaller and more fragile. She was in love with the almost smile and the gray eyes, and the way he said her name. He proposed on a Sunday in late January, which was a cold day with frost on the grass, and a sky so clear and blue it seemed to have been rinsed overnight. They were walking along the creek, the horses tied further back, because she had noticed some weeks ago that they both moved through their best conversations on foot, as though the act of walking kept pace with the actual movement of thought. He stopped walking and she stopped with him, because she had felt the change in his energy the way you felt the first drop of pressure before a weather change, and she looked up at him in the clear winter light. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring. It was not elaborate. It was a gold band with a small oval stone the color of the sea on a clear day, set simply, the kind of thing a man chose with genuine care rather than with the aim of impressing. It had belonged, he told her, to his mother, one of the only things he had taken when he left Wyoming, and he had kept it all these years without quite knowing why, except that he had understood it was waiting for the right moment. "Clara Jane Whitfield," he said, and his voice was absolutely steady, which she knew by now meant that he felt it very deeply because he was steadiest when the feeling was greatest. "I would like you to be my wife. I would like to spend every morning and every evening of the rest of my life with you. I would like to build something here that is ours together, and I would like to be the man you come home to. If you will have me." She looked at him for 3 full seconds, which was 2 more than she needed. "Yes," she said. "Cole, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and his hands were not entirely steady after all, which made her love him more than any other thing he had ever done. She stepped close to him, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against the front of his coat, and he held her with the contained strength of someone who means it completely and is aware of the weight of the moment. And neither of them moved for a long time while the creek moved past them and the cold sky held still above. They married in March of 1879, in the church in Redemption, on a Saturday that had decided without any prior consultation to produce one of those particular spring days that made all the preceding months of cold and gray feel like they had been specifically arranged to make this one day more vivid. The church was small and full, because Redemption had taken a proprietary interest in their marriage that Clara had found both touching and mildly alarming, and Mrs. Draper had coordinated the flowers with the energy of a military campaign. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had carried from St. Louis without entirely understanding why, which had spent 2 months in Mrs. Draper's cedar chest, and which fit her as though it had been made for this specific moment. Cream silk with a fitted bodice and a long skirt that moved with a weight and quality that nothing modern could replicate. She carried a small bunch of bluebonnets and wild verbena that Cole's hands had apparently been collecting from the edges of the Double M's pastures for 2 days, which she did not know until Mrs. Draper told her with slightly damp eyes that morning. Cole stood at the front of the church in a dark suit that was clearly purchased new and worn with the careful dignity of someone unused to formal clothes but absolutely committed to the occasion. And when she came down the aisle on Dr. Kane's arm, because Dr. Kane had been the closest thing to a father figure she had found in Redemption, and she had asked him with great sincerity, and he had accepted with such emotion that he had immediately developed a need to study his handkerchief very carefully for a moment. Cole watched her come to him with those gray eyes so completely open and unguarded that she nearly stopped walking in the middle of the aisle simply to absorb it. She did not stop walking. She walked all the way to him, and the minister said the words that had been said in that church dozens of times before. And when it came to the part where she was to speak her promises, she said them directly to Cole, looking at his face, not at the minister, and he said his looking directly back at her in the same way, as though the words were a private agreement and the people around them were simply witnesses to a thing that was already true. Ezra and Raphael and Hatch were there, sitting together near the back in their Sunday best, and Ezra was smiling with the full warmth of someone who had watched this unfold from the beginning and felt it as a personal satisfaction. Miss Patterson from the boarding house was there, and cried happily in the way that schoolteachers at other people's weddings often did. Mrs. Draper sat in the front pew on Clara's side, with the composed and regal satisfaction of a woman who has arranged something that has turned out exactly as she intended. When the minister said that Cole could kiss his bride, Cole cupped her face in both his hands with that same measured gentleness, looked at her for one moment that contained everything, and kissed her with the same quality that was in everything he did, honest and certain and completely meant. Redemption cheered. It was that kind of town. The celebration afterward ran well into the evening in the church hall, with the same fiddle player who had played at Christmas, and more food than any reasonable number of people should have been able to produce in a small Texas town in March. And Clara danced more than she had danced in years, and laughed more, and was aware the entire time of Cole moving through the room toward her and away from her like a tide that knew its own rhythm. Late in the evening, when the celebration had settled into a warm and comfortable aftermath of people talking and children asleep in corners, and the fiddle player taking his well-deserved rest, Cole found her near the window and stood close to her, and she leaned slightly against his arm in the way she had been allowing herself to do for months now, because he was solid and warm and hers. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. She looked at him in the lamplight of the church hall with the sounds of the people around them soft and distant. "I am so happy it feels unlikely," she said honestly. He smiled. Not the almost smile, but the real one, which he gave rarely enough that it was always a complete event when it arrived. It changed his whole face into something that made her breath catch the same way it had the very first time, on the porch outside Prentice and Sons, when he had said his name, and told her it mattered more to him than it did to her. She thought now that she had understood even then, before she had the language for it, that this was a different kind of man, and this was going to be a different kind of life. She had been absolutely right. They moved her things to the Double M the following Monday, which took considerably less time than she might have expected and somewhat more emotional effort, because leaving Mrs. Draper's felt like closing a chapter that had mattered more than she had fully appreciated while she was living it. Mrs. Draper embraced her at the door with the brisk, contained warmth of a woman who does not cry in front of others, but whose eyes were entirely clear for exactly too long. "You come and have supper with me on Thursdays," Mrs. Draper said. "Both of you." "We will," Clara said. "We will." And they did for years, every Thursday without fail until Mrs. Draper's age made it impractical, and then Clara brought the supper to her instead. Life at the Double M settled into a shape that was both simpler and fuller than anything Clara had known before. The days had a physical rhythm that her previous life in St. Louis had entirely lacked. The early mornings, the work of the horses and the house and the land. The evenings that were quieter than town evenings and more thoroughly dark and full of stars. She kept working for Dr. Kane 3 days a week because she found she needed the work, needed the usefulness of it, and because Dr. Kane genuinely required her, and Cole had never once suggested she should do otherwise. The Double M was not so far from town that 3 days of riding in was impractical, and she made the ride each way with an ease that had grown over the months until it was simply part of the week. She loved the ranch in a way she had not anticipated loving it, as a living thing that responded to care, where the work had visible consequences in the health of the animals and the condition of the land and the steadiness of the men who worked it. She took on the household management with the same organizing intelligence she had applied to Dr. Kane's chaos, and the result was that things ran more smoothly with less friction, which Hatch acknowledged by grunting in a notably satisfied register, and Ezra acknowledged by telling her directly that the place felt more like a home and less like a camp. Cole watched her settle into the life of the Double M with an expression she had learned to read as the deepest kind of happiness, the kind that does not announce itself but simply is. He said one evening in April, sitting on the porch after supper with the night air still warm and the stars doing their unreasonable thing above the Texas plain, "I have been thinking about the addition to the house." She looked at him. "Have you?" "There is a room on the south side that would get the best of the morning light," he said. "I was thinking it might be good for a nursery." She held his gaze. "I was going to mention that myself," she said. He looked at her with very great care. "Clara." "It is early yet," she said, "but Dr. Kane confirmed it last Tuesday." He reached across and took her hand, and his grip was the same as it had always been, warm and certain and completely deliberate, but his face was doing something new, something she had not seen on it before, something so open and unguarded that it made her feel as though she were seeing a room in him that no one had ever been in. "Are you well?" he asked, because that was the first thing he thought to ask, the condition of her, not his own feeling about it, and that was so exactly him that she loved him almost painfully. "I am very well," she said. "I am very well." He built the room on the south side of the house through May and June, with Ezra and Raphael helping on the evenings when the day's work was done, and it was finished by the time August arrived and the heat pressed down on the Texas plain with its full summer weight. It was a good room, simple and clean, with windows on 2 walls and afternoon light that came in warm and golden. And Cole had made the furniture himself with the quiet craftsmanship that he applied to physical work. A small crib and a chest of drawers, and a rocking chair that he had worked on in the evenings when she was reading. The sound of the tools, a kind of low background music she had grown to love. Their son was born in November of 1879, a Tuesday morning when the first real cold of autumn had come down off the plains, and the sky was the particular clear blue of late fall. He was strong and healthy and immediately and continuously loud, and Dr. Kane, who had ridden out to the Double M with focused professional calm, declared him in excellent condition and Clara in remarkable form, and accepted a glass of Cole's good whiskey with the deep satisfaction of a man who has presided over a happy ending. Cole held his son for the first time with the concentrated attention he gave to everything he valued. This enormous, careful man with this very small and furious person in his arms. And the look on his face was something Clara carried forward with her for the rest of her life. The purest thing she had ever seen on a human face, complete and overwhelming and absolutely certain. They named him James, after no particular person, but simply because it was a good solid name that suited the weight of him and the Texas air in which he entered the world. James Merritt was, from his first days, a person of strong preferences and vigorous opinions, which manifested in his early months primarily as demands about feeding and sleeping schedules that he enforced with great authority and considerable lung capacity. By the time he was pulling himself upright on the furniture and looking at the world with his father's gray eyes from a standing position, it was clear he had inherited the Merritt quality of complete certainty about whatever it was he had decided on, which in his case at this stage was primarily the desire to touch everything that was not supposed to be touched. Clara managed all of this with the same clear-eyed competence she brought to everything, and she found to her own mild surprise that she loved motherhood with a full and uncomplicated heart, not because it was not easy, but because James was entirely himself from the very beginning, a distinct and interesting person who she was permanently curious about. The legal matter of Jim Aldrich's land moved slowly through 1879, as legal matters did, but Marcus Webb was thorough, and in October of that year, the court found that the original sale of Aldrich's property had been conducted under circumstances that met the legal threshold for duress, and Jim Aldrich received his land back, plus a modest financial settlement for the months of lost income. Cole had contributed to the legal costs without fanfare, because it was the right thing and he did not require an audience for the right thing, and Clara knew about it, because she managed the household accounts with full transparency and saw the outgoing payment to Marcus Webb with its notation. She said nothing about it to Cole except, one evening, Jim Aldrich will be able to put in a winter crop. Cole looked at her across the supper table. "Yes," he said. "That is a good thing," she said. "Yes," he said again, and they did not discuss it further because nothing further needed to be said. Redemption grew in the years that followed, as Texas grew, with more settlers arriving each season, another church, a proper schoolhouse built in 1880 to which Clara contributed 3 months of organizational labor, because the building committee was in chaos, and she could not watch it happen without intervening. Cole's horse breeding operation expanded, because he had an eye for bloodlines and a reputation for honest dealing that drew buyers from a wide radius. By 1881, the Double M was running more horses than cattle, and the horses were better than anything in the county, which Ezra had predicted years before, and which Cole acknowledged with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had worked toward a thing and seen it arrive. Ezra had been with the Double M from the 3rd year, which meant he had been there when it was still a hard-going proposition, and had believed in it before it was easy to believe in, and Cole paid him accordingly, which in 1881 was still not something every rancher in Texas was doing for a black man without qualification. Clara was aware of the way some men in town spoke about the double M's employment practices, the set of their mouths and the edges of their remarks, and she was aware of Cole's complete indifference to these opinions, which was not performative but genuine, a kind of social courage that she found more admirable than any of the more theatrical kinds. She said so to him one evening directly, because she had always been direct with him about the things that mattered. "What you do here, the way you run this place," she said, "it matters. I want you to know I see it." He looked at her across their kitchen, where James was asleep in the room down the hall and the evening light was doing something extraordinary with the curtains. "It is the only way I know how to do it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is exactly why it matters." They had a daughter in 1882, born on an April evening when the spring wildflowers had come in so thick on the Double M's meadow that looking out the window was like looking at a painting. They named her Rose, which was Clara's mother's middle name, and Rose arrived with a quantity of red gold hair that was apparently not traceable to either parent but that she kept. And at 3 weeks old, she regarded the world with a focused attention that made Dr. Kane, who had come out of somewhat professional affection at this point since Mrs. Henderson in town was now the more practical midwife, say that she had the look of someone who had already decided what she thought of everyone. James, who was 2.5 and who had been prepared for this development with varying degrees of success, assessed his sister in Cole's arms with the careful evaluation of someone inspecting a business proposition, and then said, with all the authority of his Merritt certainty, "She is small," which Clara felt was a fair observation and declined to debate. The years passed with the pleasant speed of years that are full. The ranch grew. The children grew. Clara continued at Dr. Kane's 3 days a week until 1883, when Dr. Kane retired to live with his daughter in San Antonio with a peace that he had certainly earned, and Clara organized his departure as she had organized everything, with precision and care, and a very sincere goodbye that left them both more moved than either had expected, because, without ever having planned it, they had become important to each other in the way that people do when they spend enough time doing useful work alongside one another. She took on different work after Dr. Kane, first helping to run the new school's administrative side for a year, then contributing to the organization of the county's first lending library, which was a project she cared about with a personal intensity that Cole understood and fully supported, because he had grown up understanding that books were how people learned things they could not otherwise learn, and a town with a library was a different kind of town. Cole had not changed, fundamentally, which was the thing about him that she found most remarkable as the years went on. Time changed most things, people included, but Cole Merritt remained essentially himself, the same quiet certainty, the same measured care, the same absolute honesty, the same gray eyes that could convey with a single look what some men could not express in a full paragraph. He had more gray in his hair by 1884, a thread of it at his temples that she liked unreasonably, and the lines around his eyes were more settled, and there was a weathering about him that was the good kind, the kind that came from a life lived in open air and physical work, and she found him more attractive than she had the day she met him, which she had once thought was not possible and which she had been wrong about. They still argued sometimes over real things, the way honest people who spend their lives together do, because they had both strong opinions and the confidence to voice them, and there had been 2 or 3 disagreements over the years that had carried a real charge and taken a real night's sleep to resolve. But they always resolved them, because they had both from the beginning understood that the resolution was the obligation, that you did not leave important things unfinished between people you loved. James was 5 when he first rode his own horse, a small pony that Cole had specifically selected for him from a spring crop with a care and precision that Clara had watched with tremendous fondness, and the look on James's face when he first went from walk to trot entirely on his own, with his father walking alongside but not holding on, was the look of someone who has discovered a power they did not know they possessed, which was Cole told her that evening with a warmth that made her lean her head against his shoulder, exactly what horses were for. Rose, at 3, had no interest in riding and strong interest in everything that could be sorted, categorized, or counted, which Dr. Kane would have recognized immediately, and which Clara watched with an affection that contained the specific warmth of seeing a part of yourself in someone new. Sunday dinners at the Double M had become something of a community event by the mid-1880s, because Clara cooked with the same organizational skill she brought to everything else, and the table was always large enough. And people came, the hands who stayed on, the Aldrichs who had become genuine friends over the years, Mrs. Draper when she was well enough, the young schoolteacher who had replaced Miss Patterson, various neighbors whose proximity created a natural community of interest. Cole sat at the head of the table with the easy authority of someone in their proper place, and Clara sat at the other end, and the conversation moved down the table and back with the warm noise of people who genuinely like one another. One such Sunday in the autumn of 1885, when James was almost 6 and Rose was 3, Ezra announced with a brevity that concealed considerable emotion that he intended to marry a woman named Constance Monroe, who had come to Redemption that spring and who ran the seamstress shop on the east side of town. The table received this information with immediate and enthusiastic celebration, because Constance Monroe was excellent and everyone present knew it, and because Ezra's happiness was a thing that the people at that table took personally. Cole said quietly, in the general direction of Clara, "Good things happen to people who deserve them." She looked at him, and he was watching Ezra with an expression she recognized, something warm and private that was not for public display. "You would know," she said, in the same quiet register. He turned to look at her, and the gray eyes were doing what they had done on the main street of Redemption on that first day when he told her his name, seeing her completely, with the whole weight of his attention. "I would," he agreed. Ezra married Constance on a June afternoon in 1886, in the same church where Cole and Clara had married, and the Double M celebrated the event with a party in the home yard that ran until the stars were very fully out, and the children were all asleep in various chairs and corners, and adults were talking with the easy warmth of people who have nothing to settle and nowhere else to be. Clara danced with Cole under the stars that night, the way she had danced with him at Christmas of 1878, except that now she knew the shape of him completely and the feel of his hand at her waist was as familiar as breathing and more necessary. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me the day we met, when I asked your name?" He held her, moving slowly, the fiddle music coming from somewhere near the fire. "I said it mattered more to me than it did to you." "You were right," she said. He pulled her slightly closer, unhurried and deliberate. "Was I?" She tilted her head back to look at his face in the starlight, this face she had been looking at for 8 years now and still found worth looking at. "You have been right about most things," she said. "It is one of your more tiresome qualities. Only one. Don't push your luck, Mr. Merritt." He smiled. The full smile, the real one, which after 8 years she still counted each time because they were worth counting. And they danced a while longer under the Texas stars, while the Double M held them both, their children asleep and safe, their friends around them, the land spreading out in every direction into the warm June dark. There was a storm that September, a real one, the kind that rolled in off the Gulf without particular warning and hit the coastal plains of Texas with a violence that left things different in its wake. It missed Redemption by most of its worst force, but brought 3 days of hard rain that flooded the creek and took down 300 feet of the Double M's north fence line and caused the kind of widespread, practical disaster that ranch life occasionally presented with perfect indifference to convenience. Cole and Raphael and Hatch and Ezra worked the 3 days of rain and the 3 days after in the mud and cold, and Clara managed the house, the children, the horses that needed to be moved to higher ground, and the logistics of feeding everyone with the focused competence she had brought to crises since she was a girl watching her father's life come apart, and deciding that she would be the one who held things steady. When the fence was rebuilt and the creek was back in its banks and the sun had returned, and the land was doing that extraordinary thing it did after hard rain, green and washed and smelling of earth and sky, Cole sat on the porch steps in the late afternoon with his boots off and his hands on his knees, and Clara brought him a cup of coffee and sat beside him, and they looked at the land together for a while without saying anything. "She holds," he said finally. "She holds," Clara agreed. He put his arm around her, easy and permanent, the way his arm had been around her for years now, and she leaned against him, and the double M lay spread before them in the September light, the repaired fence line running clean and straight to the north, the horses moving through the lower pasture, the cottonwoods along the creek showing the first edge of gold that meant autumn was coming. James came running from the direction of the barn, 6 years old and entirely without the capacity for slow movement, with something cupped in his hands that he was very urgent about. He skidded to a stop in front of them and opened his hands to reveal a bird, a small sparrow that had presumably lost its argument with the storm and was sitting in his palm with the stunned resignation of something that has had a very difficult week. "It needs help," James announced, with the complete certainty of his Merritt inheritance. Cole looked at the bird, then at his son, with great seriousness. "What do you propose to do for it?" James thought about this. "Keep it safe until it can fly again," he said. Cole looked at Clara, and she looked at him, and the thing that passed between them in that look was everything, all of it. The porch in redemption and the frightened horse and the gray eyes and the creek in December and the ring that had waited in his pocket for the right moment, and all the years of the life they had made together. Every Sunday dinner and every hard day and every ordinary morning, and every time he had looked at her exactly like this. "That sounds right," Cole said, and he put his large hand over his son's small hands, surrounding them carefully, keeping the small wild thing safe between them. "Take good care of it. Things worth keeping need looking after." James nodded with great seriousness and went back toward the barn, carrying his responsibility with both hands. Clara watched him go, and then she looked out at the double M in the September light, and she thought about a young woman who had stood on a porch in redemption with a broken trunk and $3.42 and a bruise forming above her eye, who had not yet known what she was looking for, who had looked up at a man with storm-gray eyes and asked him his name, and had his answer rearrange something permanent inside her. She thought about all the things she had not known then that she knew now, not just about him but about herself, about what she was capable of, about what love actually was, which was nothing like the polished and theoretical version she had grown up with but was instead something physical and real, something that showed up in the work of hands and the keeping of promises and the willingness to stay present through the difficult and the ordinary with equal commitment. Cole's arm was warm around her. The horses moved in the lower pasture. Rose's voice came from inside the house, narrating something to herself with the focused determination of a 3-year-old who has decided the world should be organized more efficiently. The creek moved in its banks. "Cole," he said, "I would like to tell you something." He turned to look at her, that full gray gaze, uncomplicated and complete. "I am glad the door hit me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and she felt it against her side where she was leaning into him. "So am I," he said. They sat on the porch of the double M until the light went gold and then orange and then deep and violet, and the first stars came out over Texas. And James's sparrow apparently survived, because 3 days later it flew from his cupped hands into the afternoon sky and was gone, and James watched it go with a satisfaction that needed no words, and Cole watched James, and Clara watched Cole, and the life they had built together held around them like the land, permanent and wide, and entirely their own. Rose learned to read at 4, which surprised no one. She sat at the kitchen table with a primer that Clara had gotten from the lending library, and she worked through it with the methodical focus of someone doing inventory. And when she could read, She wanted to read everything, and Clara brought her books from the library every week, and Rose made her own careful notes in a small journal that Cole had given her, which she kept with great privacy and evident seriousness. James learned to ride properly by the time he was 7, which meant he rode with the easy confidence of someone born to it, which in a sense he was, and Cole gave him a horse of his own at 7.5, a sturdy black quarter horse that James named Captain with no apparent irony, and they went out together on the weekends, father and son on the Double M's land, and Clara would see them from the window or the porch, the tall man and the small boy moving together through the grass. And the feeling it gave her was so complete that it almost hurt. She was expecting their third child by the spring of 1887, which they learned in February, and this time Cole's response was somewhat more practiced but no less moved. The gray eyes very warm, his hands very careful, his first question again about how she was, which was still the first thing he thought to ask, and she loved him for it the same way she had loved him for it the first time. He built another addition to the house that spring, because the south room where James had slept was now James's room, and Rose had the small room behind the kitchen, and there needed to be room for one more. And he did this with the same care he brought to everything at the Double M, the work itself a form of love. Their second son arrived in September of 1887, a quieter arrival than James's had been, a calm, watchful baby who looked at the world from his first days with a gravity that made Dr. Whitmore, who had replaced Dr. Kane, say that he had the look of someone who was thinking things over carefully before committing. They named him Thomas, and Thomas was from the beginning a different kind of person than his brother, slower to noise and faster to observation, and the combination of the 3 children was something that made the Double M a place of remarkable and constant variety. By 1890, Redemption had grown enough that it had 2 doctors, a second bank, 4 churches, and a population that the county census put at just over 800, which was nothing compared to the cities back east, but was a substantial thing for a place that had been a raw settlement a little over a decade before. Cole's horse breeding operation had become well enough known that buyers came from other states now, from Oklahoma Territory and New Mexico and as far as Kansas, and Ezra managed the breeding records with a precision that matched Clara's own approach to record keeping, which she considered the highest compliment she could observe. The lending library that Clara had helped establish had a permanent home in a building on the east side of town by 1890, donated by a merchant who had done well and wanted to leave something lasting, and it had a collection of over 400 volumes and a librarian named Mrs. Castillo, whose husband was a partner in the Aldrete farming operation. One of the ways in which the small networks of fair dealing and mutual support that Cole had been building since the beginning had woven themselves into the fabric of Redemption's better nature. Clara thought sometimes about the injustices that persisted alongside the good things, the ways in which the law and the social order of Texas in the 1880s made life harder for some people than for others in ways that were not the result of character or effort, but simply of the accident of who they were. She thought about it with the clear eyes of someone who had always tried to see things as they were, and she talked about it with Cole in the evenings when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and he talked about it with the same directness. And what they said in those conversations was honest and not always comfortable, but was always between 2 people who agreed that honesty mattered more than comfort. Ezra and Constance had a son in 1889, whom they named William, and who arrived in the world at roughly the same age as Thomas Merritt, and the 2 boys grew up in a proximity that made them as close as the Merritt children themselves, which was, Clara thought, exactly how the world ought to work, and exactly how it didn't always work, and exactly why it mattered to work at it. The century turned, and the wild country that had surrounded Redemption in 1878 was different now, less wild and more settled. The frontier pushed further west by the relentless mathematics of settlement. Cole was 50 years old by 1900, and he wore his 50 years the way he wore everything, without unnecessary comment. And he was as capable at 50 as he had been at 30 and considerably wiser, which she appreciated because she was 44 and wise about different things, and the combination of their wisdoms had proven over the years to be more than the sum of its parts. James was 20 by 1900, and he had been working the double M alongside his father since he was 15 with the serious commitment of someone who had always known this was his, not as an inheritance he was waiting for, but as a place he loved. He had the gray eyes and the Merritt manner and a laugh that was entirely his mother's, and Clara watched him become the man he was going to be with the awe that never entirely went away, the particular awe of watching someone you grew from become themselves. Rose at 18 was the sharpest mind in Redemption, and possibly in a significant portion of the surrounding county, and she was heading to Waco in the fall of 1900 for the women's college there, which she had determined upon at the age of 14, and pursued with the methodical focus she brought to everything. Cole had supported this without reservation, which Clara loved him for specifically, because she knew it was not the universal position of fathers toward their daughters' educations in 1900, and it was the position he held not because it was easy, but because it was right. Thomas at 13 was the quiet, thoughtful one who was going to be something specific in ways that hadn't entirely declared themselves yet, and Cole said, one evening with an affection that was enormous and perfectly contained, "He is the one who will surprise us," and Clara thought that was probably true. The evening Clara particularly remembered, many years later, as the one that caught the whole thing in a single image, was a Sunday in the autumn of 1901, when Rose was home from Waco for a few weeks and James was working with Raphael, who had stayed through everything and was now the double M senior hand, and Thomas was at the creek with William catching something, and she and Cole sat on the porch in the October light with coffee and the quiet of a late afternoon that had earned its peace. The horses were in the lower pasture, the good ones, the product of 20 years of careful breeding and honest work, moving through the golden autumn grass with the ease of things in their right place. The fence lines were clean and straight. The house behind them was full of the sounds and evidence of a life well and fully lived. Cole reached over and took her hand, the way he had been reaching over and taking her hand for more than 20 years, with the same unhurried certainty, as though this was a thing he intended to keep doing. "Are you happy?" she asked, the same question she had asked him on their wedding night. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when the feeling was the greatest. He looked at the double M in the October light, at the horses and the land and the good fences, and the cottonwoods along the creek that had grown considerable in 20 years, and then he looked at her. "More than I can tell you," he said. She smiled, and the autumn sun was warm on the porch, and everything was resolved and everything was whole, and the man who had told her on a porch in Redemption that his name mattered more to him than to her was still here, his hand warm around hers, his gray eyes as steady and as full of her as they had always been. She had not known his name that first day. She had learned it, and it had cost her every other man's name without a single regret. It was the best trade she had ever made.